Okay. Okay, so welcome everybody to this roundtable event of the EACAS 2021 on critical animal studies and the education system. I will say a little about the topic and perhaps introduce the topic, give some hints about what each speaker is going to talk about. And the format is going to be that each of the three speakers will give short talks at the beginning, and then maybe pass comments and questions between themselves, and then we will open it up to everybody else as well. And yeah, I think that's everything to say in terms of format. Yeah, okay. So the education system and thinking about also children and young people in critical animal studies has come more and more onto the agenda of critical animal studies in recent years, I think. And there have been several examinations of the education system which take a kind of necessary approach, seeing the education system as a key element of the animal industrial complex, a part of the structure of society which works to guarantee conformity to norms of animal use. And that's ongoing work, really, and it's important work. But then also there is work which looks at opportunities in the education system for critical animal pedagogy. In other words, the idea that we can contest these sort of normative human-animal relations which are encouraged and taught in our education systems, and make real contributions to giving new ideas to young people, but also obviously thinking of the education system not just for young people, but also lifelong learning as well. And so critical animal pedagogy is something that can potentially make real contributions to the lives of non-human animals and make connections with other types of critical pedagogical approaches as well, be that, for example, feminist critical pedagogy or sustainability education, which has not had a very good history of including non-human animals in its remit. And also, we could explore how something like critical animal pedagogy and environmental education necessitate a rethinking of how we see children and young people as well. If you think about the rise of the climate strike movement and how that has led or at least encouraged changes to thinking about the role and status of children as potential agents for change in the context of the climate crisis. And since obviously the concerns of human-animal relations are also overlapping with the climate crisis, then there's lots of relevance there as well, like reconsidering children as agents of change rather than somehow passive recipients of adult education. Perhaps also contrary to this, we might want to stress the limitations of education to affect change, and that's something that Vasile will explore in his contribution. And Dinesh intends to focus on tensions that he sees over whether formal educational institutions, obviously schools, universities, are actually equipped to support transformative change or not. And also we surely need to situate expectations around CAS education or critical animal pedagogy within people's assumptions that they may have about the education system generally. And that's a topic that Helena intends to speak to in her contribution. And we could, for example, ask, what hopes are there for critical pedagogy when many countries, I would say, are doubling down on a kind of more instrumental philosophy of education at the moment, where education comes to be narrowed down in its construction to be about employability, to be about the economic contribution of education, and not the sort of transformative change role that's often also argued for in terms of the education system. Okay, so without further ado, I mean, we haven't actually, I've realized we haven't actually settled on an order of speakers. So I think I might just ask for a volunteer to go first and kick things off.
Well,
Does
I guess
anybody?
I can do it if
That's
nobody
great.
else
That's great.
volunteers.
Yeah.
So I'm fine with
Yeah,
that. So.
and I should add also that we were, we did hope to have Teresa Laura Bidart as a contributor to this, but unfortunately she did have to withdraw yesterday. So that's why we are merely left with the wonderful 3 people that we have today. Thank you. Over to you, Helena.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to begin with thanking the conference organizers for initiating this roundtable on the education theme. I'm very, very honored to be invited, so thank you so much. I will try to share my screen because I have 1 or 2 slides I would like to show. So is this visible? Yeah, okay, good. So here we go then. Critical animal studies education is a form of social change. It's knowledge with a special purpose. And this creates a lot of potential for us, but also problems and challenges. And what I will do now is to outline basically 5 ideas about education drawn from philosophy of education, particularly the Dutch education philosopher Fred Piesta, but also from my own teaching experiences. And I hope that these reflections might help us to collectively develop CAS education practice. So a lot of education is a sort of search for the magic formula, we could call it. This idea that only if we can find the optimal way to teach, then learning will somehow automatically, magically take place. But there is no straightforward connection between teaching and learning. And this is, of course, because what is presented by the teacher is not just passively taken in by students. There are lots of other things happening here. And so education is an inherently unpredictable activity, and we can never be certain about its effects or outcome. And I should also say that all the ideas that I present here, the reflections that I present here now, they pertain to education in a general sense, but of course my specific focus is critical animal studies education. So we have no control over other people's learning processes in a fundamental way. And the shifting classroom dynamics that we find ourselves in can take the issues that we teach in very unexpected directions. And of course, the long-term outcome of education is even more unpredictable. What sort of knowledge actually stays with our students for a longer time? We have no idea about that, really. And as CAS teachers, I think we have to see this unpredictability of education as a potential rather than as a problem. So given this unpredictability, then what can we do in critical animal studies education? There's quite a lot of education that tries to exert this kind of impossible control. A lot of education out there tries to take hold of either our minds or our hearts, or perhaps both, and also to decide beforehand what and who we will become through education. I think a quite common assumption is that I would like you to become like me. I am a vegan, so I would like you to become a vegan as well. Or I'm an animal rights advocate, and I would like to see you become the same. But who has the authority to say this? With what right do I call myself a teacher? So my point here is that education can't impose anything on anyone. And if it does, I would say it's not education, it's rather indoctrination. So what can we do then with these limitations? We can create conditions for learning to take place. Conditions which will aid newcomers in coming into the world and creating themselves as subjects. And newcomers in this sense is totally regardless of age. It is not only young people or kids that we talk about, it's even adults, because we are all newcomers in various fields, right? So in CAS education, what we can do is to invite newcomers to enter the world of human-animal relations, to contribute to it, and perhaps also to change it. So CAS education provides tools to critically analyze previously received assumptions about human-animal relations. And we have to be aware that students are differently prepared to engage in this analysis, which may affect them in unexpected ways. And I think that these insights help us develop as CAS educators. For instance, I believe that as educators, we tend to make assumptions about our students all the time, perhaps unconsciously. But who are really your students? Who is this person that I have in front of me? Listen to them. Make CAS education relevant for your students wherever they are in life. And this is why I prefer to speak about critical animal pedagogies in plural form, because we all learn in different ways. And what works for one person will certainly not work for the other. We need a multiplicity of teaching and learning approaches also in CAS education. For instance, very few people are actually born vegan. I certainly wasn't. And this is a process that some people may enter, but some never will. And this is something we have to accept, of course. And also, moreover, to make the differences in the student group a resource for teaching and learning. We can involve our students in sharing their experiences they have with them, with animals that they bring with them into the classroom or seminar room. We can invite them in co-developing courses or seminars. We can ask them to take responsibility for and to reflect on their own learning processes. And this can be done in very different ways, of course. Now, teacher enthusiasm is a key to engaging students and aiding the learning processes that they are in. And our ambition as critical animal studies educators, I think, is not only to show that a society where non-human animals are liberated is possible, but that this society is tempting and appealing and worth working for. While compassion is an important part of CAS education, so is teacher passion, I would argue, and trying to create a lived experience of the change processes that we theorize in the classroom. As critical animal studies educators, we have to continuously keep reflecting on our own work and to develop a theoretically informed education practice. And we have to accept there is no given outcome of CAS education or of education generally. But in my experience, CAS education has a lot of potential. It can open new ways of seeing, thinking, living, feeling, and acting. It can never impose, but it can inspire individual and collective work for change. It can provide tools for sharpening critical thinking and deepening analytic skills. It can provide a theoretical foundation for activism and political work and enrich theory with activist and political practice. It can create a forum for students to meet, discuss, and share knowledge, ideas, and experiences regarding animals. It can catalyze and support processes of personal and professional development. And in short, CAS education can create synergy effects extending far beyond the seminar room. And I think this is actually quite a lot, also given the limitations of education in general and CAS education in particular, perhaps. So of course, the next question that arises is how we even get to the point where we can actually develop critical animal studies courses in our departments and schools. And I hope that we will have a chance now to discuss these issues further with everybody. So this was my brief presentation to start off this. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Helena. It's really good for setting the scene on some of those issues. And gosh, I must apologize deeply. It's been a very long day, and I was very remiss in not even introducing all three with their bios. And I guess I just assume that everybody knows who you all are. but I don't want to like cause any further interruptions. So the bios are obviously in the program. So shall we move next to Vas? Would that be okay? Okay, thanks.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So before I begin, I'd also like to thank Richard and everyone who works on EACAS. It is a wonderful organization. I could not be more grateful that it exists. I'd also like to thank my two fellow presenters. They are two of my favorite people in the field. Pretending to be asleep, willed ignorance, disavow, and the limits of education for critical animal studies. It is always possible to wake someone from sleep, but there is no amount of noise that will wake someone who is pretending to be asleep. Jonathan Safran Foer, Eating Animals. Here is how I begin every course I teach on animal studies. Drop this class. You do not want to know what I know. I do not want to know what I know. No one wants to know what I know. I know what I am about to teach you, and trust me, drop this class. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle divides the concept of evil into 4 categories. The first, troublingly, he refers to as the bestial, which refers to those who do something evil because they know it is evil. The second category is those who know the good yet fail to do it. I need to give to charity, but I don't. The third category he terms the ignorant. They do the evil because they truly do not know. However, he also has a fourth category, which he terms willed ignorance, a knowing not knowing, a kind of decision not to know what a person does in fact know. I am increasingly convinced this last category of willed ignorance defines people who eat meat in the industrialized West. If a space alien were to come to Earth, they would almost immediately deduce the reality of factory farms and our relations to animals. They would note that McDonald's only charges a single dollar in the United States for a hamburger. And despite this small price, McDonald's has to provide a bun, give condiments, have napkins, pay their workers, even if it is not much, and still make a profit. How then must the cow be treated? That people's minds do not ask these questions is not an issue of ignorance. It is an issue of willed ignorance. I have experienced the same phenomenon of willed ignorance in my own teaching. I've now taught 12 courses explicitly on animal studies. In other courses, I often teach the realities of capitalism and the horrors of the commodity fetish. For example, I frequently teach the working conditions in the factories that produce Apple's iPhones. Students are angry when they learn this information, but not at me. They're angry at Apple and/or capitalism as a whole. I've never had a student argue with me, tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about, tell me it's untrue, recite out of context Bible passages in support of Apple's businesses. But I've experienced all of these moments when I teach undergraduates about humans' commodity fetish with other animals. One, the labor conditions of the iPhone is true ignorance. The other, humans' relations to other animals, is willed ignorance. They are mad, not at the reality, which at some level they already know. They are mad at me for making them know what at some point and some level they have already decided not to know. Perhaps our model should be less one based on ignorance and one based more on trauma, at an almost suppressed decision that often happens at a very young age when a child first learns that chicken is chicken, but is then convinced, perhaps by a parent, not to think about what they already know. Or perhaps the model is an addict, mad not because he doesn't have a problem, but mad precisely because he knows that he does. For this knowing not knowing is not only on an individual level. To bring up the question of the animal is to bring up the one secret, I think perhaps more than any other, that our society has agreed to never, ever mention. Derrida terms this collective knowing unknowing disavowal, a term he applies to both the Holocaust and humans' treatment of animals. The Nobel Prize-winning novelist J.M. Coetzee makes the identical argument, not because they believe that these are morally similar occurrences, that is not their argument, but because both of them evoke the absurdity of claiming simply that no one knew what was happening. It is not that such people are lying. The truth is more complicated than that. It is that this truth of not knowing something this horrible, this pervasive, requires a kind of constant work and effort that could only exist if, in fact, everyone already knew. Without disavowal, one would normally ask, where have all my neighbors gone? One would ask, why do I never see them? Without disavowal, one would normally ask, where do all the animals I eat come from? Why do I never see them? But some questions, in some societies, one learns not to know, not to ask, not to even think. In the short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, Ursula Le Guin, herself a vegan, posits a thought experiment. Imagine an ideal world in which everyone has to learn one secret. A child is constantly being tortured, kept in perpetual filth, darkness, and misery for their entire life. That is the secret that the whole world depends upon. It is the secret they have learned not to even think about. As the narrator reassures us, one thing I know that there is none of in Omelas is guilt. Perhaps she means there is only guilt, but then again, perhaps not. What is the effect of a horror you both know and do not know? How can we teach people what they already know? Jonathan Safran Foer asked the same question in his text, Eating Animals. As animals activists, scholars, writers, and educators, we know how to wake up those who are asleep. But how does one wake up someone who is only pretending to be asleep? As we have this talk today on animals and education, I hope we can phrase these conversations in these terms. Less, how can we educate the truly ignorant? More, how can we wake those with willed ignorance and disavow? How can we wake those pretending to be asleep? Here is how I end every course I teach on animal studies. What I want is not for you to go vegan. That is not what I want. What I want, all I have ever wanted since I was 9 years old and first found out what is happening to animals, is to be wrong, is to be lied to and to have been tricked, for everything I know to be true to have never happened, for all of it just to go away. But I can't have what I want, so I have to do the second best thing, which is to change it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vas. That was a really nice framing, and yeah, it's very provocative. Thanks for joining us from Georgia. Are you in Georgia at the moment? Yeah, thank you. But the prize for the greatest time zone sacrifice goes to Dinesh, who's joining us from Sydney, and I believe it's 5:28 a.m. potentially. Something like that.
I think so.
Yeah, you're not sure. I'm not sure. Dinesh, who's obviously at University of Sydney, and this is my backtracking introduction. Helena was joining us from Gothenburg, University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Okay, Dinesh, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Richard, and thank you to yourself and all the organisers of what looked like a really amazing conference. So I hope it's been really fulfilling. It's really lovely to be amongst friends and have known the three of you for a really long time. So it's just lovely to be on this panel. I want to acknowledge that I'm on stolen land. So I'm coming from Sydney. Sydney, Australia is a settler colonial nation. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in my suburb in Sydney, which is in inner Western Sydney. So I just want to pay my respects to the elders and the people who own this land and had their land stolen from them. I wanted to just, and it's a hard act to follow, unfortunately. Like Helena's an expert in education. Vaz also an expert and eloquent, far more eloquent speaker than I'll ever be. But I guess I wanted to just start by just talking about, from my perspective, the enormity of the task of education before us. And I'm thinking education, at least in its institutional forms, but also education more broadly. So in its institutional forms, meaning schools, universities, technical colleges, but also outside of that, the broader role of knowledge transfer and creation and it's the interest for CAS scholars. And I guess the interest for me is actually large-scale social transformation. And I think that's the kind of education we're all interested in. Firstly, of course, we're interested in ending mass-scale violence towards animals, which is a huge, perhaps utopian task. And I think Az's talk gives us a flavour of the utopia behind the demand, political demand. But as CAS scholars, this is interconnected with other forms of violence, oppression, exploitation. So I think all of us aren't happy to settle with ending violence towards animals, but are interested in other forms of oppression that interconnect with human violence towards animals, and that includes capitalism, homophobia, sexism and patriarchal cultures related to gender normativity, ableism, homophobia. So we have these interconnecting forms of oppression, and we're talking about this large-scale social transformation. I guess part of my interest in starting this is to ask, well, to what extent are institutional forms of education fit for purpose in addressing this sort of transformation that we demand? And so I can only think of these things as in a structural way, right? And it was sort of really nice to hear Helena's talk and think that's what we dream of as teachers, right? The philosophy of education is kind of what we ideally want to do with the people we teach. But then there's another part of my brain which is, okay, well, structurally, what do the current institutions do? And so there's and let me break this down to a few different functions maybe for how we could think about institutional forms of education. Firstly, very clearly in our contemporary societies, educational institutions do the work of adding value to human labour, which will then add value to capital. So we do this in education, in universities. So I work in a university, and a lot of my job is making somebody more expert so that capitalism can exploit them for value. And that's a very kind of Marxist comment, right? But I think that's actually quite true. And many of us who work in educational universities see this every day. So we're constantly told, how is this relevant to jobs and vocations? And, how do we make our courses more career relevant? How do we link with industry to deliver more of what industry wants from education? Many of us work in institutions that are highly neoliberalized, and increasingly so. So that, and one way I would put this is that education, both schools and universities, are increasingly drawn into the cycle of capital itself, so that increasingly educational institutions do the work of just simply reproducing what capitalism wants. And I think one of the kind of really sad things about this is that in many parts of the world, maybe most parts of the world, students pay for the privilege of adding value to themselves so they can add value to capitalism. So in many parts of the world, we're lucky to have public forms of education or public subsidization, but that's rare. Most parts of the world, certainly higher education, students pay for the privilege of adding value to capital through themselves and their knowledge. There's obviously an ideological function associated with education, and this is about the reproduction of elite ideas. And this goes to the heart of the problem for CAS, is that many of the institutions we're dealing with from school upward reproduce the hierarchical anthropocentrism that prevails in our dominant culture. And so this is one of the challenges we have, is how do we challenge this as people involved in education in some sort of way. Related to this, universities certainly are actively involved in producing the technical and scientific knowledge that increases and intensifies the exploitation and violence towards animals. So this is both providing a technical knowledge for animal agriculture to intensify the work that they do. And so many of us who work in universities know that almost literally, but probably metaphorically down the corridor, there are many more academics being paid directly to produce knowledge that will be used to increase the intensity of animal agriculture. And many academics are paid to perform the research on animals for pharmaceutical companies and cosmetic industries. And, so that in a sense, there's this sort of problem as well going on there in terms of the production of knowledge and the way that institutions do this. There's finally the function for universities and schools and technical college and other formal institutional sites of power, of educational power, in reproducing elites and reproducing status hierarchies within societies. So firstly, this happens in, and I'd say it's more kind of, sorry to drop names, but in a Weberian sense, so from Max Weber, one function is to provide the means for societies to grade, hierarchize, certify, and then legitimate different forms of status hierarchies that will appear in society. So and as we know, the tension as an educator, particularly in university, is students want a piece of paper, but you as an educator want to give them the knowledge, right? So they're in a rush to get the piece of paper that will get them a job. And we're there trying to say, hey, there's also this other stuff that's important. And this is unfortunately the Weberian structural relation of universities. Universities are there to produce a piece of paper that will give students a place in a hierarchically structured society. So somebody will go off and say, I'm a lawyer now because I've got this piece of paper. There's also the kind of Foucauldian sense that universities are part of the disciplinary apparatus of societies. So we train people to be docile subjects in societies. And this is a constant tension we're all facing. So as a CAS scholar, you want your students to go and be activists and change societies. But of course, the nature of universities is that certainly schools and universities is making individuals docile. So look, I didn't want to, obviously this is just a kind of tour of social theory around universities and schools, but I guess I wanted to just put this frame before us to just make the point that I'm not sure about the place of institutional forms of education in affecting the kind of radical transformation that we're after. This doesn't mean that we all don't experience amazing moments of education. So those of us who work in universities, and this is why I really warmed to Helena's presentation, those of us who work in universities and maybe have the rare opportunities to teach CAS education directly within a university do sometimes experience these moments with students where they change, right? And it's amazing when it happens. But I'm struck by the enormity of the task and the structural barriers we face as educators within the current institutional structures. So I wanted to end by just posing a different question, which is, what sort of knowledge creation and knowledge transfer do we actually need for the kind of transformation that we're seeking? And related to that, how does this relate to the social movements who will make this change, who we want to make this change? And what is the place of the intellectual and not the academic, because actually they're intellectuals everywhere and not necessarily academics. And I'm assuming all of us here are intellectuals engaged in intellectual activity. What's our place within this story? So I wanted to end by just talking about Antonio Gramsci. And it's because I've just been reading Gramsci more recently. And people who know me will know I'm a Foucauldian fundamentally. But I've just been fascinated by Gramsci. And particularly one thing I've been interested in is how Gramsci's story about knowledge and power and transformation. And maybe to just give you a really quick, and I'm sure everyone knows the kind of story from Gramsci, but I'll give you a quick summary of this. Gramsci was aware that capitalist society was foundationally supported by a hegemonic knowledge system, which was controlled by the owners of capital. So this both cements the role of capitalism and also the state by reproducing ideas that enforce consent. So if you can control the media, you can control schools, you can control education, then you control the means of consent to that society and the oppressions that come along with that society. And that's a really horrid, quick summary of Gramsci, but hopefully we don't have that much time. I've already gone over time. For Gramsci, the point for left movements was to generate the counter knowledge or the counter hegemony that would allow for the creation of a new worldview, an alternative worldview. And this was an intellectual task. It was a job for intellectuals within that movement. However, Gramsci didn't see being an intellectual as being in a university. For Gramsci, intellectuals arise from a social movement, within a social movement, and they do the hard work of analysing society, re-narrating society, and developing the strategy for change that will be required, and to constantly debate this within the ranks of the social movement. For Gramsci, of course, he's talking about the Communist Party, and we don't live in a world where there are many communist parties left. And certainly there's a lot of questions we might ask about what kind of parties or movements are equipped for change, for this sort of change. But one of the fascinating things that Gramsci talks about is what the role of a party is in this story. For Gramsci, the party is a movement of intellectuals. And there's a remarkable paragraph in the prison notebooks where Gramsci says that the point of a party is for people to come from anywhere in society. They could be involved in trades, they could be involved in university, they could be involved in as an administrative clerk. But when they arrive in the party, they become an intellectual. And what he means by this is, firstly, the party is the opportunity to develop as an intellectual, i.e. to learn, to be educated within a social movement. The party is secondly the place where you undergo the analysis of society to counter the hegemonic ideas that prevail in society. And finally, the party is the place where you are involved in the strategy that is required to achieve change. And when I think about this, I think, well, that's the kind of education that I'm interested in. And I'm curious, where does this happen? And this is both a challenge for both existing intellectuals, all of us, but also the animal movement itself. So when I look at the animal movement, I wonder, where is the place for this intellectual activity? Do we actually have social movements that are equipped or recognize the need for this sort of intellectual activity to be part and parcel of the movement? And secondly, where is our place? It's fine for me to sit in a university an elite university like Sydney University and write papers, but does this actually relate to the kind of transformation we need? And that's a self-critique of the work that I do. So hopefully that's a bundle of really ideas are just thrown out there, but that's what's going on in my head when I think about education.
Thank you very much, Dinesh. That was really, really quite comprehensive. I don't want to sort of make any personal contributions chair at this moment, although there's lots I could say. I'd really like the three of you to kind of bounce off each other for a little period, because I'm sure what each of you has said has inspired lots of thoughts amongst you. So perhaps we could move into that phase of the roundtable, and then, of course, open things out to what is now, I think there's 50 people in total in the room. I'm sure everybody's keen to join in. So yeah, let's perhaps if Helena would, no, perhaps if Dinesh and Vas would want to speak about Helena, or I don't really care in terms of direction and structure, but if somebody just would like to kick things off in terms of an element of what either Helena, Vas, or Dinesh has said, and then we can just move organically from there, I think.
Maybe I can just add one reflection to Dinesh's talk here. And I think you really conceptualized education as a sort of site of struggle, really. A socialization agent of society, perhaps one of the most prominent, most established, most important ones. And just one tiny addition, that I think one factor here that contributes to the problem is that education is also so connected to the future in a way. So there's an assumption, I think, really entrenched in society, that those who have influence over education has influence over the future as well, because there is this trope that we educate for the future and so on and so forth, not just for the here and now, but actually for the future, and we form the future through our students. And I think this really powerful idea might explain, the resistance that we experience as CAS educators as well, because those colleagues or those institutional structures that don't want to see a world where animals are liberated because the human privileges will really, have to go in that sense. They don't want to let us in because we have this assumption that there's a power over the future somehow with education. So I think that is an aspect that adds to or complements or chimes in with what you were saying, Dinesh. I'm not sure if you agree with that, but I just wanted to complement with that.
Thanks, Helena. I actually absolutely agree. And it illustrates the power of education. And that's the tension I think we face. And I think it's inherent in your fantastic talk as well, is the power that's there is the power of transformation for the future. And I guess, so maybe to just, to give you one example of part of why I'm thinking about, well, to what's fit for purpose for this work that we need to do, is that many left movements in the 20th century didn't have any fantasy about universities providing the kind of knowledge that was required for social transformation. So many trade unions, for example, set up forms of worker education because there was the acceptance that universities were elite institutions and wouldn't actually provide training and knowledge to most people in society, and knowledge that would allow them to critically see society for what it was. So certainly, like where in Sydney, you see the remnants of this, right? So there are, various forms of worker education around the CBD, old buildings and stuff like that, where trade unions basically ran often in concert with academics, ran classes for working class people. And I think this is really interesting for us to think about, is to what extent do we think about education and the site of education within university? I guess the one thing I wanted to ask you to talk a bit more about, Helena, because I'm really interested in the process. So, and this is the tension we all see as educators, is the radical promise that, you know, as an educator, you experience this in the classroom, the promise of actually making change. And I see this in your work, and I know that you particularly draw on Deleuze and Guattari. And I can really see this, so when I'm not a Deleuzean, but when I'm in the classroom, I can see that kind of this Deleuzean moment of every moment being potentially a moment of promise or transformation, where, as you say, something quite unpredictable can happen. And this event being something that can move things forward. And I guess I was interested in maybe your reflections, either in personally or in terms of your own research, because I know you've done so much more research in this area about this relation. How does this relate to the kind of institutional barriers that I've talked about, and how do you see that tension playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, there's a lot of issues here to talk about, really. Yeah, there are plenty of tensions, of course. I mean, we do have these structures, these institutional resistances, the capitalist tendencies to take hold of education and sort of govern it, and so on and so forth. And this is a reality, and we have to sort of relate to it. But still, I think it's education philosopher Nick Payne, education theorist Nick Payne in the UK. He talks about education as an open space of potentiality, which seems to me a bit over-optimistic. But in terms of a Deleuzean interpretation of that, I think there is something there, and I think there is something there in the encounter with every student that we meet in our courses or in educational spaces. And in my practical experience, I think that, you know, once we get the opportunity to actually teach critical animal studies or critical animal pedagogies, I feel that, you know, these issues can be such an eye-opener to students. And I think this also chimes in with what Vas talked about in his talk. It can be such an eye-opener. And once this eye-opener has really done its work a little bit, then I think it's hard to actually to close it down again. So I think this is where we have the potential, actually, in the relation with each student. Yeah, I think this must happen in many different ways, of course, and we can never predict how it will happen or with whom or in what way. But once it happens, I think we recognize it. And so working with our students in a way that actually respects their different positions in this area, I think it's a humble way of working, but also a very potentially transformative way of working. And you know, we can even ask them to start, once you've introduced the issues of critical animal studies and the situation of animals in society, there is just a very, very small step to ask them to critically, you know, analyze their previous education experiences, especially with regard to animals. So we can actually ask students to create these stories, these experiences in class, and actually ask them to start looking with a critical eye on their own socialization processes. And once this happens, I think there's enormous door that you know we can open here in a way. So yeah, I think the potential might lie exactly there, in my experience at least. Like perhaps a sort of unlearning from previously perceived or received so-called knowledge about human animals.
Yeah, if I can respond. I mean, so obviously I don't believe that there is no value in education about critical animal studies. I wouldn't keep offering classes about critical animal studies if I thought that was the case. And certainly students do change, and it can be eye-opening. Just last week, I had a student from 6 years ago email me. The title was Surprise, and she told me that she had just gone vegan and wanted me to know. So all of that is significant, and it matters. And it's important work that we do. And there are ways that we can do it even better. And there's ways that I want to figure out how to do it better. At the same time, I worry about a kind of limit of what is possible or achievable. I've kept informal polling of my students for several years now, and I never get more than 10 to 12% of the students who say that they go vegetarian or vegan. A larger percentage say that they are considering humane meat, and a larger percentage say in vitro meat, a larger percentage say maybe they're trying to eat less meat. And I'm not saying vegan is necessarily even the goal per se, but there may be kind of an upper threshold of the number of percentage of people that we can actually persuade in or out of the classroom. To gesture towards Dinesh, there may be a limit of education and a kind of almost innocence in our belief that we are going to somehow persuade people through our rhetorical abilities or our educational skills. And I just wonder if that is, in fact, not the case, that there is a percentage that we can get, but there is a vast majority that's a sort of Habermasian logic and rhetoric is never going to reach.
Yeah, I mean, if I can sort of jump on that. Again, I totally think so. And of course, I guess my talk also spoke about this a little bit. Surely there are enormous limits of education. I don't think we should actually try to convince ourselves either as CAS educators that education can do it alone. It will never happen due to what you're saying, Vas, and also due to what Dinesh was saying, the structural limitations that we have. I mean, we need new revolutions in all areas of society. We need a new economic system, a new political system, a new legal system for animals. But I think education can contribute to that. But it will never do it alone, I think. And yeah, I mean, there is an upper limit of people, obviously, that we can reach. And maybe this is not even, the purpose of education. I mean, what is the purpose of education? There's no consensus on that either. It's a very heated debate, actually. So, but we can open the door, I think, to some students. And I personally feel that if I can do that with one single student, not necessarily to turn them vegan, but to sort of open the door to a different way of a critical way of looking at human-animal relations, and perhaps trying to, sort of conceptualizing the animal perspective, the situation of animals in society. Even with only one single student, I think the teaching job is worth it. So I don't necessarily see that the value is necessarily instrumental in that sense, that it's quantifiable, but it's actually a relational thing. Because we don't know what this single student, this single person will do. Maybe we are speaking with it, maybe we are teaching a future teacher in teacher education, for instance, who in turn will reach an enormous number of students and their parents, perhaps, and their friends, and their relatives within the course of his or her professional life. So, because we don't know, I think there is where the potentiality lies, but maybe I'm just an idealist here.
I just want to stress, Helena, that I actually think it's not idealism in the sense that the tension, the problem we have is that, and I think Vas's talk illustrates this as well, that education is in some ways almost the most fundamental thing that we need to do, because we're trying to rupture and change a worldview that is utterly prevailing and dominant and underpins the continuation of these relations of violence, exploitation, oppression. and as Vaz's talk illustrated, in some ways these worldviews are welded on in ways that they're not with other worldviews. I mean, there's something so fundamental about the kind of, you know, attachments involved for students that so it's both highly essential, but the problem, of course, is the reality of, and so we know this from, and I think you probably know this better in terms of some of the stuff that I read in Sociology of Education and Bourdieu and others that, you know, kind of talk about just the way that, you know, we know that education institutions just reproduce. Their function is often to just reproduce. And certainly I'm aware of the Australian studies that just show that, you know, although there's the possibility of transformation always there, the general rule is that people go into schools or universities and they come out in exactly the same class position. And that's, you know, it's only rare that people do move. And that should tell us something about the limits of educational institutions. So that to me is the kind of tension we're in the midst of, is that realistically, if we're going to make the changes we want to make in terms of transformation, education has to be central. But the institutions themselves remain ill-equipped, at least in my view, to do this. And that's the kind of, I don't know what to do with that tension. I find it really difficult to comprehend what we should be doing as intellectuals in that space.
I may say briefly a few things, and then I probably won't say anything at all for the rest of the time, because it feels abusive from my position as chair. So much of what's being said is really resonant. The micro positive experiences of teaching, and obviously the comments from Helena and Vas in their presentations about the pedagogical approach is really important for, you know, whether you how you approach the learner, and whether they are likely to be receptive to the way that you frame particular aspects of the topic. And this semester just gone, incidentally, I've never taught an animal studies or critical animal studies module ever, because the opportunity has never arisen. And I've tried, but not enough students have chosen the module. So that's interesting. Obviously, that's part of the kind of neoliberal experience where often modules only run if a certain number of students choose the module. And there might be lots of different reasons for why it's not being chosen. But this semester just gone, I did have the quite thrilling experience of supervising at the same time an undergraduate dissertation, a master's dissertation, and a PhD dissertation, the latter two of which are still ongoing, all about veganism, the undergraduate dissertation on vegan parenting, the master's on the relationship between veganism and feminism, and the PhD on the experience of being a vegan vet in the UK. And so these are kind of great examples of the kind of micro positive experiences that we might have, and then totally resonates with Vas's comments about, you know, these are just like little great little micro experiences, which, you know, these are students perhaps that, you know, I can't really take any credit for changing them, because they already sort of had come and they'd already sort of found things out for themselves. But then when you juxtapose these little micro positive experiences with the urgency of systemic change, they kind of take on a tragicomic kind of character. They're beautiful. They're in and of themselves, they're beautiful pedagogical moments, because you work together, you interact. There's the relationship between teacher and learner is, you know, in this kind of Paulo Freirean sense, is symmetrical in a way, and that makes it all the more meaningful. But yeah, in terms of the scale and urgency of change required, it kind of is sort of tragicomic in my view, and that's kind of part of the situation in which critical animal studies finds itself. I just wanted to say, finally, one comment about Dinesh's skepticism over formal educational institutions, and we were co-writers on a paper 5 years ago led by Fiona Probe and Gramsci on the sustainable campus, trying to think of the university, the campus, as a generator for transformative change in terms of the kind of food that's catered for on campuses and that kind of thing. It's called the Sydney Declaration. It's an incredibly undercited paper. But again, maybe that experience contributed to your skepticism, Dinesh. I don't know. But then you seem to be turning to social movements. But then other people might argue that social movements themselves are also co-opted by capital in terms of, they become profit-making, or like the organizations anyway, the formal organizations which sometimes comprise social movements are sometimes also co-opted in a way. And so how can social movements create pedagogical spaces? What you were saying kind of reminded me a little bit about, you mentioned the communist example. I thought of feminist consciousness raising groups and that kind of tradition as well. But it's difficult when you're feeling that the formal educational space is being squeezed and controlled. Maybe you can turn to social movements, but how could that be successful, I suppose, is what I'm asking. So I don't know if anybody wants to, any of the three want to respond to anything I've just said, but it's definitely approaching the time where we should open the discussion to everybody.
Did you want to open it up, Richard? Are you muted?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, I think we've said enough initially, haven't we, to hopefully inspire some questions and comments to the three of you. Yeah. So you can type in chat, or you can use the hand raising. Okay, I've Pablo Perez Castillo, I think, was first. So we'll go with you, Pablo, and then Seth.
Thank you all for the very interesting discussion and for your talks. I really enjoyed it. My question was for the three of you, but mainly for Vas, because my work, something that is quite central to my work, is the question of visibility. So the idea that, if the slaughterhouses, the walls were made of glass, this idea that then animal liberation would be within reach, as it were. And I really like, and it's often kind of undermined or not stressed as much as I think it should be, the work of Timothy Patriat in Every 12 Seconds, the chapter, The Politics of Sight, I think it's called, where he kind of argues that, contra Michael Pollan, that we could have some sort of, if you like, slaughterhouses that the walls would be made of glass, and then people would pay to go inside the slaughterhouses and kind of enjoy the experience, as it were, something of the sort. And I mentioned this because you were saying that kind of the stereotype, or what you've come to understand as a meat-eater, and this idea of willed ignorance, that is what defines meat-eaters the most, or something like that. And there is a constant work from meat-eaters not to know. I wrote these two kind of comments. And I'm really unsure about that, because I think there are kind of two forms of violence here that I think, one is that violence is concealed by all sorts of things. So we cannot see violence as violence because of, the established epistemological order, the human-animal distinction, reason and reason, all sorts of things that are structuring our subjectivities, capitalism, commodification, all sorts of things that prevents us from seeing the violence when it's violence. And there is another side that is more Nietzschean, perhaps, of the pleasure of violation. That there is pleasure in subjugating others. On the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche draws on this. And I say this because I've been writing recently about exactly these things, and I looked for data on direct acts of violence. And 1 in 10 people in the world, for example, fish for recreational purposes. And that means that they see feces on their hands, dying, suffering, blood. 1 in 10 people in the world do that. 1 in 3 women in the world have been sexually abused at some point in their lives, at least once. In Spain, we have bullfighting that is broadcasted in the country, in the main TV channels. Huge amounts of violence, and people witness it, they see it. So I'm not sure what willful ignorance means in this context, because it's so there in front of our eyes. So I think what interests me more, because it seems that the stress is on the choice, that people choose, they decide not to know. And I really not so sure that people, what is the content of that decision? If we are, as Heidegger would say, falling into a world that is incredibly violent, that is a culture that, you know, is sexist, racist, ableist, and so on, and the structure, the subjectivities of many people. So I think the constant work that people should try to do that is really difficult is try to deconstruct that and try to change that kind of subjectivity. Self-deconstruction, and then and this is when education can be important, perhaps. Try to think, well, what kind of education should we have to try to enable that kind of deconstruction? And it's a very difficult question, I believe. And that's why I suppose, as you were saying, right, that only like 10 or 12% of the people you've taught sort of changed and became vegetarians or vegans, something like that. I don't know, I just feel that there is this still belief in the animal rights movement that if people knew, things would change. And I'm not so sure. And I think your course in a way is proof, like it's kind of evident that, you know, you are teaching, like you are teaching them. I love your work, by the way. I should have said that at the beginning, I love it. And only 10, 12%, you know, there is this kind of change because there are so many other things around it. So yeah, I just feel uncomfortable with this idea that knowing is, that people decide, and you know, all this thing about knowing. So I just wondered how you responded to it. And then on the second, but very briefly, there's a wonderful article by Bourdieu called "Education as a Conservative Force." I think it's so brilliant. I would just, if people in the audience perhaps have not taken a look, I really like it. And it sets out the things that Dinesh was perhaps explaining. It's a very nice article. That's all.
Thank you for the excellent question and comment, and I could not agree with you more. I believe that the animal rights movement has a myth that if slaughterhouses just had glass walls, everyone would become vegetarian, by Paul McCartney. I am increasingly skeptical of this claim. You mentioned Michael Pollan in The Omnivore's Dilemma. He has chapters titled Abattoirs with Glass Walls. But that doesn't lead to vegetarian or veganism. It leads to the pleasure in seeing the suffering of the chickens, which he enjoys killing, which Joel Salatin says children as young as 5 and 6 come up, and he reassures the reader they have no squeamishness in getting in there and cutting some throats. They have a great time. And Michael Pollan himself loves killing the pig at the end. He compares it to getting high. He does psychedelics, and that's the experience. And he fails to kill the first time, so it's not just running around or being in the woods. And he comes back, and then he can actually kill the pig, and it's just the greatest experience of his life. And it's sexual for him. And he finds the corpse of the animal disgusting and doesn't want to eat it. So it's not even about the meat; it's about the visceral love of getting to kill. And you give the great example of bullfighting. The violence of bullfighting is not hidden; it doesn't turn people off. That's what they come to see. That's what they enjoy. And the history, Dinesh is a far better scholar of Foucault than I am, but the history of getting rid of killing of humans in the public square didn't end because of squeamishness. It ended because people enjoyed it too much. They became moments of breakdowns of the efficiency of capital and breakdowns of lawlessness because there were parties and festivals. And that's why it was put back into the prison system as the beginning of discipline and punish highlights. Well, so too, if you look at the history of the ending of the slaughter in the public square of animals, it didn't happen because people got squeamish or were distressed at seeing the suffering of animals. It happened to do with greater efficiency of being able to process the animals. Few people know they used to give tours of the Chicago slaughterhouse when it first came, and there were lines down the street. So this myth that if we could just show people what was going on in animals, I've termed it the kind of myth of innocence. Somehow we think the world exists and no one made it. Well, 70 billion animals aren't killed a year and no one helps. 70 billion animals aren't killed a year because there's a few evil people going around tricking everybody. We probably have the world we have because by and large, most people want that world.
Thank you for that question and that answer. I'm going to take Natalia and then Darren, and then there's a couple of comments / questions in the chat as well. So over to you, Natalia. I'll make sure that there's an even gender split in terms of people asking questions as well.
Okay, thank you, Richard. My question actually comes from the same kind of exasperation with the willful sleeping of a lot of people that Vas and also Pablo expressed. It made me think that there must be something in it for people, like a benefit for people to wake up, to make them want to wake up. And actually you see that in a lot of social movements as well, like sustainability. Like you want an electric car, not because it's better for the environment, but because it looks cool, or it makes your status higher. Or maybe you want sun panels on your roof because it makes your electricity cheaper. And then it made me wonder what made me want to wake up? Like, was that something pure? Like, was that real concern for the animals? Or was there maybe something else? Because we make up all these narratives in our head that justify our choices or that explain our choices. And maybe, yeah, it's interesting to explore that. So my question for the panel would be, what made you want to wake up?
Who would like to answer that first?
No, maybe I could have a go.
Yeah,
I haven't woken up. I haven't woken up. And I'm not sure about the framing, the waking up framing. Obviously, so look, and I don't want to be discourteous because I think what you're talking about is the moments of individual transformation where you start to see something for what it is or in a different light. And of course, you know, I've had vegan moments, I've had moments around race and understanding my relationship with a racial hierarchy. I've had moments where it clicked about how things work in a capitalist society. I also just don't think I've woken up. I mean, I just at the same time, I just feel like there's so much mystification around that I'm not clear that and maybe this is maybe also slightly directed at Vas's talk as well, is the one issue I have with that that reading of acrasia or willed ignorance from Aristotle is that it assumes that we have the truth and we're kind of we think that others don't have the truth and we have some despair about that, which I think is of course it's true. I mean, as CAS scholars, we're aware of things that horrific things about our society that others want to actively deny. But I'm just struck by the fact that I don't know. Like I'm still waking up, and it's an ongoing process. And that's to come back to maybe the comments I made at the end about Gramsci and the party, and what I think I really want is to be part of an active intellectual movement that allows me to spend my life developing, to know better, right? And that's because I can't pretend that I've woken up. I just feel like there's actually so much more. There's so much mystification around the kinds of oppression and violence that we have around us that surely the goal is to keep waking up or keep, you know.
And that's surely an appropriate kind of humility position, isn't it, for the intellectual? Not to assume that they're awake. And there's a lot of discussion, cultural discussion at the moment about the phrase woke and so on. And there's a lot of right-wing backlash, interestingly, about the term woke, which is somewhere we could go. But Natalia, did Did Helena or Vas want to also respond to Natalia? Or you don't have to, we can move on to the next question if you prefer, or.
I guess I can just add some reflection, some personal reflection. I think this, you know, the point made here that it's maybe not so waking up the moment necessarily, but an ongoing process. I think that is a position that is, you know, very humble and very important to realize that there may still be things ahead of us that we are not aware of right now, but we must be prepared to meet somehow. But in terms of history, in my own personal history, I think one perhaps potentially interesting aspect of that is that my sort of, well, up to now, a transformative moment, if you want to put it that way, did not happen through ethical reflection, really. My veganism, for instance, didn't come about through ethical reflection. It came about through a very physical experience of nausea. So, yeah, I mean, if we believe as teachers that we can sort of educate people through rational models or through ethical ideas, I'm not saying that this is not valid or valuable, but there might be something else at play here, actually. And I think this also speaks very much to what we discussed previously here. The relation between knowledge and change is not straightforward. It's not that we will educate a lot of unknowing people and then change will happen automatically. Behavioral change or system change, I don't think it works that way, really. So there are many other things at play here, I would say, also in my own experience.
I'll make just a couple of comments. So first, I want to clarify that by no stretch did I mean that I was woke, and that is also not what I meant by trying to reference Aristotle, that I know the truth with any kind of capital T. I used to always say that I'm trying to be vegan, even though I don't consume processed sugar because it consumes about bone char, but it's impossible to be fully vegan in the sense we don't harm animals in the world. No one can do it. And more than that, I certainly don't think that I am somehow arrived when it comes to issues of gender, race, disability, class, and so much more. And increasingly, the scholars I seek out to try to understand my own feelings of frustration, not that these are morally the same in any way, are authors of Anti-Blackness and Afro-Pessimism. I mean, I think they are the people grappling with a kind of similar denial. Those are the sort of experiences I get when I teach about race, or the closest I get to when I teach about animals, where suddenly even very smart students somehow can't make 2 + 2 = 4. And so it is a similar kind of willed ignorance and a kind of knowing, not knowing based on privilege, which is different than true ignorance. But to get to what I think is the heart of your question, like, well, why is it that I stopped eating meat? And this also is my general feeling that everyone knows. It was 9 when I realized that chicken was chicken. And I went to my public library and checked out Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. I have many criticisms of Peter Singer, but the truth is, and I've told him this, I criticize him because of him. If he hadn't, you know, to some degree helped and caused me to become vegetarian. But I was able to figure this out at 9. Now maybe you go, well, Vas is a very, you know, smart guy, but I have my doubts. I mean, I think so many children have a moment when they say, hey, I love animals and I don't want to hurt them. And then their parents, the people they love and care the most in the world, tell them, you know, you'll die if you don't, you have to. So many of my students have a kind of trauma that occurred when they were young that, like, we have to some degree unpack. When they wanted to be vegetarian, there was a study that came out from Harvard that said that a large number of children go independently vegetarian. Their parents aren't vegetarian, they go vegetarian on their own for exactly these kinds of reasons. And so, and it's about 10% of the children. So there are people who go vegetarian on their own and then society comes and like leads them astray. At the same time, there were 2 children when I was 9 who wanted to come and play with me, and they wanted to shoot squirrels. Now, no one was making them do it, and they didn't eat the squirrels. And that was always abhorrent to me. So I didn't have to do some sort of logical reasoning to decide that shooting squirrels would not be fun. It was just intrinsically, obviously not fun. So at the same time, I think we also have to admit that we shouldn't pretend that everyone is the same, and that it is quite possible that there is a difference. with a certain percentage of people who will be horrified by certain kinds of violence, and a certain percentage of people that will get in there and slit some throats without any hint of squeamishness.
Okay, I'd like to move to Darren Chang because they've been waiting patiently. So Darren, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, thanks to all the discussants for sharing your insights so far. I have a question that might seem kind of random given the kind of scope and direction of the conversations so far, but I was wondering if you could share your views on sort of the dangers and promises of including other animals themselves and position in the education process and sort of position them as educators and teachers themselves. And so I have two examples that I've been kind of reflecting on that I came across lately. And so the first one is the work of Kathy Shupley, who is an assistant professor and veterinarian at University of British Columbia. And so she did this really interesting educational experiment where she and her team trained laboratory rats and just rats, trained the rats to become these highly sociable creatures, and basically, we can think of them as kind of like companion species, companion animal kind of that you have. They know how to do certain tricks, interact with humans, and then these rats were then later on were used. I think it's fair to say they're used to train lab workers, but to basically the experiment was to see if the lab workers themselves would have this sort of attitudinal change upon interacting with these rats. And sure enough, yeah, like through interviews later on in the analysis, they said that the lab workers were surprised and caught off guard, didn't think rats could, possess all these capacities, and really sort of coming from this sort of ethics of care analysis, they said, yeah, sort of the rats were the teachers, and they taught the students, to these lab workers, young lab workers, to become more empathetic in some ways. And so at that sort of the kind of micro individual level that some of you have mentioned, we see this kind of small transformation, which maybe could go on to have broader institutional transformations, especially given the context of such a difficult place to make change like animal use in science, right? So I think that's just kind of interesting, not unproblematic, of course. And then the second one is just the work of Catherine Gillespie on animal sanctuaries. So she's done that sort of experimental feminist pedagogical work, and again with mixed results, right? She said, some students, after spending a semester visiting particular animals at sanctuaries, it has completely changed their lives, and others not so much, right? Again, so that's a totally different context where that kind of direct human non-human interaction sort of education is happening, and yeah, so yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, of course, this could be expanded to now. We can talk about the presence of animals in media, David Attenborough documentaries, and all these kind of things. But yeah, to what extent can we even say that the animals themselves are teachers and educators, and what role do they really have to play?
Yeah, I guess I can start there. I really find it a bit problematic with sort of positioning animals as educators for human purposes. Certainly because it's on our own conditions that we sort of impose this role upon them. And it's not voluntary from their side, I would say. So I do have a problem with that. But there is an education discourse in education studies, which is, well, quite strong, I would say, about animals as educators. But I think we have to look critically at that. I mean, on what are the conditions, and on whose conditions are we sort of assigning this role, these expectations on the animals in education? Yeah, in whose interests? And what are we hoping to achieve with that?
Do Vas or Dinesh want to add anything to?
Maybe I could just say there's one hesitation is in some of this sort of stuff, and obviously not directed at those authors you mentioned, Darren, is a reliance on the pure encounter with animals within the classroom as being so transformative, rather than, if you like, the requirement to curate or assemble this experience so that it is transformative. So I do hear people say things like, oh, if only we could just bring animals to the classroom, this would be, people would see that they're sentient creatures and blah, blah, blah. But of course, as we've actually been discussing, there's no necessary reason why interacting with an animal will change how you behave towards animals. And so I guess just, yeah, and maybe this is just building on Helena's point, we need to think carefully about what does this experience actually look like? What are the conditions in which animals are made available to be deployed within educational contexts, and what sort of curation work is required for this actually to be a transformative process?
Yeah, I'm actually right now involved in a pilot project regarding so-called literacy dogs, dogs used in classrooms for sort of animal-assisted pedagogies. And I'm in the middle of it, and I don't have any results yet. But and I'm working together with an ethologist, a dog ethologist, which is extremely interesting. But it's very problematic in so many ways. And to me, I mean, tentatively, I would say that these dogs, in this case, but there are many other animal species also used in these ways, they are service workers, I would say. And that brings us back to the initial discussion in this round table that Dinesh brought to the table, that the capitalist ideology sort of sipping down to the micro level on schools, service workers for us.
Okay, I think we have a few things to attend to in the chat box. Some are just comments, but some are questions. And then we'll get to Paula Arcari, who's got her hand up as well. But if we could all just have a little look in the chat box. I think all the way back up to Linda. I'll just read this out to be more efficient, I guess. My PhD is investigating the lived experience of young vegan children in the Scottish education system. I hope to use results to encourage greater inclusivity for vegan children more widely. I agree that a vegan future rests in the hands of those possibly not even born yet. As things shift, even with capitalists cashing in on the plant-based diet, do you agree that a multi-agency approach is required to start to shift the axis of speciesist practice? If so, what do you see working alongside the qualitative evidence I hope to produce? Okay, it's an interesting, different kind of question. Helena, do you want to speak to that?
Just asking for clarification, a multi-agency approach?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that term vaguely from kind of childcare and so on. But Linda, do you want to just clarify what you mean by a multi-agency approach? Linda, are you still here? Oh, she has
Linda
no mic.
said she hasn't got a mic. Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. Okay, Linda says, I just mean the different elements of the system working together. Okay. Does anybody want to speak to that, or is further clarification required? Or Okay, Linda, if you're sure. Okay, but it sounds like a really interesting PhD, and there's a few things going on at the moment in terms of veganism and children. By all means, feel free to contact me after the conference. There's a few things you might be interested in. Seth, okay. Seth, do you want to speak, or do you want me to read out your comment up there?
Yeah, I can just I can just speak here.
Thank you, Seth.
I remember what I said. But just the thought was about you know, the discussion, especially with Dinesh's reflection on the Gramscian, you know, alternative institution, and it made me wonder also with Vasa's maybe sense of the hopelessness of it, or the way that it's hard to work against those that are willfully ignorant. And so it had me thinking in two directions. One is within the institution. I mean, that's something I when I was more involved in my grad program, I tried to build some connections between what I was doing in cultural studies, and I made some contacts in, they were actually people studying epidemiology and were interested in animal disease and the sort of one health model of disease, where we think of animals, humans, and the environment. And it was amazing to have these collaborators, at least briefly, for that. Although we had very different paradigms about what what we were doing and what the purpose of it was. And it just made me wonder, because I was at Ohio State University, which has a big agricultural department. It's like much better funded, of course, than anything we do in cultural studies. And if only there was a way to reach over there, whether it's in animal agriculture, veterinary science, you know, law, these other realms where people are kind of on the ground floor being trained within the industries themselves that we're working to transform. It's hard work to cross those differences, but I wonder if there's something productive there that could be done, or if not, then how do we build some alternative institutions? And my mind then goes, with my background in religious studies, to, you know, religious institutions that are focused on that transformation of the self, you know, building a sense of values, bringing world transformation, even depending on which tradition we're talking about, or just harmony within the self and community with the divine or with the ultimate. And so, you know, is that really, like, is Gramsci's party a kind of secular religion? And maybe that's okay. Can we create something that is, you know, not dedicated to a certain metaphysics, but has a shared ethical project of educating people in an alternative institution, and trying to work on exactly that problem of, I want to, but I don't want to. I, you know, have a vision of what's true, but I can't quite get myself to do it. So I thought I'd put that out there as a question, if any of you have thoughts.
Thanks so much for the question. And maybe to start, I want to go back, because I feel bad suggesting, or maybe implying, that maybe Vaz thought he was awake. So that's not. I suppose I'm interested in the problem of willful ignorance, because I see it, but I also wonder what goes beyond that, and what does it imply to say that. But maybe related to that, and it's a great question, Seth. So weirdly, for the last 2 years, I've been reading a lot of early Christian history, and there's a long story about why I've been reading it, but part of it actually came from my interest in how does transformation happen in societies, and recognizing that the genealogy of lots of radical thought globally comes from radical religious traditions. And I think this is really interesting. Maybe relevant to this, people may know, and Seth, you're probably more read on this than I am. There's been a flurry of interest in the last decade in Paul's letters, or Paul's epistles, from philosophers like Agamben and Badiou, partly because they read this radical message in it. And the reason it's relevant is that in Paul's letters in the Bible, he talks about waking people up he talks about this, that the process of transformation as dragging them out of the slumber and showing them the truth, right? And so and that's what I want to just reflect, that this tradition is part of religious thinking, is part of our contemporary political movements. And maybe relevant to this as well, Walter Benjamin, made a comment, I believe, sometime in his career that the problem with the left was that it the contemporary left was that it lacked a spiritual basis, that it was actually seeking a kind of quite radical transformation of both society and self that was hamstrung by being secular in nature. Now, these are all kind of abstract comments, but there was quite a deliberate, for me, it was quite deliberate to mention Gramsci and the Communist Party, because in a sense, what I see in the radical party, the revolutionary party, is a grouping that is wholeheartedly focused on societal change. And it's the thing that I see that is missing today. So if those of us, there's a few of us who are working, I know Richard is working in this space around animal agriculture and climate change. And most people working in that space who are vaguely critical recognize that at this point, our economic system is completely incompatible with where the planet needs to go, or where we need to go as humans to prevent the catastrophe that is coming. In other words, realistically, we need to be talking about radical transformative change. And this comes back to the comments that Richard made about social movements. Contemporary social movements seem to lack the focus on this task. So I absolutely agree that I think we are talking about the development of particular formations that are equipped for this radical change. And this is why I think thinking like something like the party is interesting for me. There's also, I agree, Seth, that there's something that we might even describe as spiritual in this, because it isn't just about transforming institutions, it is actually about transforming selves. And I think that tradition is interesting to ponder historically. And I weirdly think that I'm saying it publicly, but I don't often say it publicly. I think vegans are contemporary veganism is a kind of contemporary spiritual movement. I don't mean this as we're religious and blah, 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 that we have religious institutions behind us, but it's actually a form of radical transformation of society that also relates to the self. And to me, that the only analog is something that looks spiritual.
Yeah, and I would just add that it's interesting that you were thinking in terms of Christianity and Paul's letters, because the immediate reference for waking up to me is the Buddha, which is my focus in terms of the traditions. But if anybody else wants to share a thought, or we can move on, because that was a great response. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Richard, did you want to say something?
No, I was just seeing if anybody else wanted to respond to that.
Sure, I'll just make a quick point. So structurally, in terms of trying to make allies with other parts of the university, it's going to be somewhat difficult. You mentioned ag science. Within the United States context, the animal agricultural is pretty heavily invested in sort of recruiting, funding, and training a crew of scientists that's sort of like climate change denial for petroleum industry, or the sort of cohort of climate change denial for animal ag business. Frank Mitholliner is one of the most famous examples in terms of climate change, and most of the research that we hear about rotational farming or these sorts of things are actually industry funded. In terms of veterinarian science, and I don't know if Helena wants to talk about this, some of her work that I enjoy and appreciate the most is she has these studies of the way that the vets are trained and their empathy most people become vets because they love animals, they care about animals, isn't a problem. That is part of the system. And so like when they break down and cry, that's wonderful. And they say, I know you're going to be a good vet. And then the goal, this willed ignorance, this disavowal, this ambivalence, is the purpose of the education, where they're being taught, if they don't care about animals at all, they will be a bad vet. They're being taught to somehow love animals and kill animals, love animals and support ag business, love animals and work at research centers that experiment on animals simultaneously. And that ability to do both, to love animals and to hurt their exploitation, is the point of the education system. Now, I may have misstated that, so I want to step back and then Helena can clarify if I got that wrong.
No, I mean, that's exactly what I found, actually, that to my surprise a little bit, I didn't really expect that. But I found that if we talk about, animal science education, veterinary education, it's kind of emotionally manipulative. And the experienced teachers in, well, the research I have done, really puts this knowledge to work. How the students will respond and what to do when they respond to animal slaughter, for instance, on study visits to slaughterhouses. And I found that very disturbing and very problematic, of course. But I think, one thing we could do here is actually to shed light on this and to do research on this. How does veterinary education really work? And provide a sort of eyewitness accounts as critical scholars, critical researchers, and publish these results and make them public. So I think that is perhaps one step toward, demystifying perhaps a little bit veterinary education from this quite common view, I think, that, we educate vets to be animal saviors, to save animals from disease and unnecessary death. It's actually the other way around. But through very, very sort of sophisticated, emotionally manipulative, if you want to put it that way, teaching approaches. And what I think is a bit scary is that education knows exactly how to work here. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is an enormous, education discourse to sort of dig into. And also interestingly, in the Swedish context, I'm not sure how it is in other countries, but the agricultural university has not been under, the Ministry of Education. Historically, it has been under the Ministry of Agriculture, which says something. So all these ideas and discourses and norms around education that we have, that it's sort of a democratic institution and student influence is very important. This just hasn't existed in agricultural education, science, animal science education. It's sort of unknown the way I see it. So yeah, there's a whole problem context here that we can dig into.
Okay, thanks everybody. Paula Arcari, I should say some of the background to organizing this roundtable, some credit really needs to go to Brett Mills and Paula Arcari, because I believe they put the initial impetus into framing this roundtable, and Paula is now going to make a comment or ask a question.
Okay. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everyone. I've really enjoyed this. There's a few parts to my question. I think parts of it might have already been answered too. So I guess I'm thinking of pedagogies much more broadly, seeing how broadly it could go. So if there's limits, as Vasile was saying, if there's limits to what educational institutions can achieve, where else can these critical pedagogies take place? So considering it seems fewer and fewer people will have access to university, and they will be the ones with financial means, it's increasingly heading that way. Are there ways to engage more in the public sphere with people who don't go into academia? And for those people, the animal advocacy movement is really the place that they meet these issues. And there's as a few people have already said, I think there's a lot of problems with current advocacy movement framings, and perhaps, as Dinesh was saying, there's some curation needed there too. So yeah, few parts to that. Don't know if it makes sense.
I think maybe would Dinesh be the most obvious person to initially answer that, or might be
okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, and this is where I'm really interested in these histories of worker education for this reason, that part of that history was moving the task of education, or not expecting educational institutions to be equipped to do this. And the reason I'm interested in the history is that I'm struck by the way that animal advocacy movements, at least the prominent ones that I'm aware of, have limited focus on this sort of education. There are examples, actually, there's been a conversation in the chat with Linda about work of some animal advocacy organisations that have deliberately tried to reach out to schools, and they see this sort of role as important. But as far as I can see, this is a minority of the kind of those sort of social movements or animal protection movements in terms of the work that they do. And I'd also say this is also a democratic problem with the movements that we have. So lots of the movements we have are fundamentally non-democratic in function. So you have animal protection organisations often run by, and I'm not critiquing them because they're doing important work, but they're often run by a set of personalities in a non-democratic way. And they often are attached to particular repertoires of action, sometimes fetishistically. So something like, again, I'm not having a go, but Anonymous with Voices is a really good example, where you join that to take part in an action that's already decided in advance for you, right? And I think we've got a long way to go to develop a kind of democratic movement where education is fundamental, where you arrive to be inculcated and involved in an intellectual environment, where you get built up as an intellectual and will contribute to both the analysis and the strategy that is required to go forward. And why I'm interested in some of the left traditions in the 20th century particularly was that at different points there was a recognition that this was important. So worker education was seen as important because formal education institutions failed to provide this education. And it was recognized by those movements that in order for us to make change, we need to develop our intellectual base for change. And so I guess that's what I'm interested in. So just on a personal level, though, I'd say that one area that I'm really fascinated by, and I want to experiment with personally, is to what extent can those of us in universities donate our intellectual labour to the movement in organised ways, and not donating our work to, say, animal protection organisations in terms of an analysis, but in terms of doing the work of transferring this critical knowledge to those who want to know and those who are going to be involved in movements. That to me seems a really fascinating thing to think through. I don't think we're there yet in terms of animal advocacy movements being equipped to do that sort of stuff. But I'm curious whether that's the space that we need to be thinking about, working with animal movements or working with left social movements generally to do this sort of labour and be able to donate our own intellectual labour for that task.
And that kind of gets to the heart of one of the sort of key elements of critical animal studies, which is supposed to be all about making connections with advocacy and so on. Yeah. Paul, did either Vas or Helena want to add anything in answer to Paula?
No, I can just agree. I mean, I think it's tremendously important. I do have a little bit of a problem positioning myself as a sort of intellectual who will sort of enlighten animal rights advocates. possibly, communicating critical knowledge that they might not possess. I mean, I think I have a problem with that sort of. I know this is not what you meant, but there are sort of implications there that I find a bit problematic. But I think another way of putting it is that, as humans, we can't avoid learning from each other all the time. So wherever we are, there will be a sort of co-exploring and exploring as co-learners rather than as teachers and students. So if we can sort of nurture that sort of approach, I think it can be, very productive and very fruitful. Regardless if you're sort of connecting with social movements or community groups, whatever, adult education contexts. There are plenty of sites, I think, where learning will happen.
Yeah, and I mean, Paulo Freire's work is clearly vital there for, warning us against that kind of banking model of education where we somehow instill ourselves as experts. And obviously, in social movements, there's so much expertise in terms of strategy. And I think I saw a recent online discussion that Dinesh was involved with. Was it with Ava? It was the BASN meeting. And I think you were maybe talking about strategy and how the kind of intellectual ideas of critical animal studies might inform strategy, but then the people who are involved in interesting movements at the moment, like Animal Rebellion and Animal Think Tanks, a group, I think there's people at this conference from that group. They're very much interested in strategizing and probably have a lot more expertise on that particular issue compared to, let's not assume the expertise of the so-called academic, is basically what I'm saying. I think we have, so we got 5 minutes, and so there's that question, isn't there? Sorry, Vas, did you want to come in?
Yeah, if I can just quickly, just to go against this, I think precisely the role of the intellectual or the academic is to point out errors in activist work. Unlike Dinesh, I am happy to criticize large swaths of the animal rights community and strategies, which I find deeply troubling, from violations of everything from trans rights to anti-Blackness to wearing Klan uniforms to having deeply sexist to parodies of sex violence PSAs, on and on. It's hard to imagine how anyone thought that this would be an effective strategy. And I think that is what we need to be doing, calling out the animal rights organizations which are not making wise factual decisions and having good strategies in the public square. We need critical animal scholars. We need scholar activists. So we need to be activists, but activists also need to be scholars and making reasoned-based approaches that will actually work. I know we're out of time, so one last thing. I'm so tired of all the winning. Every webpage I go to, somehow we are winning. PETA's webpage, we're winning. I keep hearing how we're winning in terms of plant-based food sales. We're winning of the number of vegetarians or vegans. You feel like a curmudgeon. The only way in which we're losing is that more animals are dying in worse conditions than ever before. The worst day in the history of animals is today. It's always today.
Yeah, and I would just say critiquing strategy and respecting forms of expertise are not mutually exclusive. So I think both are vital. Listen, we have 3 minutes, and I think there was a really interesting, not that we have to robotically stop at 10 o'clock, but there was an interesting question from Linda, who reformulated her question in terms of primary school. It was back up. So Linda reframed her question to ask how CAS education could be introduced or incorporated as early as primary school to reach our future vegans. To me, this is interesting because there's a debate within early childhood education, which is obviously aimed at primary school children, but also younger than primary school. about sustainability education and about climate change education as well. And, you know, what are the sort of ages which it's suitable to start talking to young children about the climate crisis and these kinds of questions. And this would be, I'm sure, echoed in terms of, you know, people would bring in a protectionist discourse to say you can't possibly talk to primary school age children about animal slaughter, etc., 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 because of, you know, it somehow violates a notion of childhood innocence and so on. So I wonder, I mean, I wonder if anybody has a response to Linda's question there in terms of, we've had some focus on the university tertiary kind of tier of education. I wonder if anybody would want to say anything about what CAS education might look like in terms of children, you know, less, you know, under the age of 10, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge issue. I don't think we can cover it really in 1 minute. I think we have left, I'm not sure, but yeah, and it's not my primary area either, early childhood education, but I do have some experience from teaching preschool teachers to be, which is always extremely interesting. And I think this may be a way, you know, I'm thinking more and more that we have to sort of target teacher educators, go into teacher education and educate these students. I think it's an extremely important arena, not least in early childhood education. But what I usually hear, the students are really interested in animal issues because they sort of realize that there is some connection between children and animals, that there is something there, some attraction or some bond or whatever you want to call it. But then the issue comes up about the parents. How should we deal with the parents? I mean, if we do teach something that goes against the parents' values, then we'll be in deep trouble as preschool educators. And this is usually, you know, a huge discussion in the seminar room. And I mean, my response to that would be, you know, if the parents really don't want their kids to encounter any other perspective than they meet at home, so why send the kids to school at all? You know, we can homeschool them. I mean, it's a democratic task of society and education to actually, I mean, you can even use the pluralist argument, you know. The animal issues are out there in society, and therefore it is a task of education, even preschool education, to sort of involve animals in an age-appropriate critical manner, because these issues are out there. So I think this is something we have to work with continuously.
Well, you may only have had 2 minutes, but I thought that was a very good answer to that question. Yeah, and Abby has said that the topic of early childhood education deserves its own roundtable, and I think, you know, there's lots of interesting tangents that we've explored in this session, which again could be explored in their own roundtable. Wow, thank you to everybody present here, obviously, especially the 3 speakers, who I now sheepishly paste their full extended biographies into the chat box. And hold on, let me just do that properly. And great. Okay, just coming back to the front. Okay, great. So yeah, thanks everybody. This has been recorded and will be available on either the CFAS or the EACAS website in a few weeks' time, I'm sure. And I noticed there was a call in the chat for maybe compiling a reading list, which might emerge from the discussion that we've had in this roundtable. And it's nice, I think, any conference event, not for it to be something which then just tails off and doesn't have some kind of continuity, but something that actually produces something, and the fact that it's been recorded and maybe we can generate some reading list as well can mean that it goes somewhere, and maybe it can be built upon at future CAS events. So listening into a discussion such as the one that we've had this evening, just why can't we have this every week or something? But it would be it would be nice to have more contact. Maybe that's something that we can take from the pandemic and the advantages of the virtual context, that we can maybe do better as a CAS community in terms of having semi-regular virtual meetings and not relying on these kind of once every year, once every 2 year conferences. Okay, so I'll just finish again by saying thank you. And obviously at this point in time, you would clap for the 3 roundtable speakers, and you can do the virtual clap in the corner. Yeah, it's not quite the same, but yeah, thank you so much, especially making the sacrifice across the time zone. Okay, so we'll start again in day 2, and this starts. The talks start at 9:30, but we'll have an introductory session at 9 o'clock, and you can enter the conference from like today, from about 8:40 a.m. British Summer Time in the morning, and look forward to lots of fascinating talks happening tomorrow. Okay, thank you very much. I'll stop the